All right, good afternoon, everybody. We are so delighted to welcome you to the penultimate installment of our year-long monthly Monday Map Lunch series here at the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education at the University of Southern Maine. So thanks for everyone who's joining us at these events. Just a couple of Zoom procedural issues. If everyone could just mute themselves, that would be terrific. We're actually not doing this one Zoom webinar style. So we are on an actual live Zoom. So if you mute your image, unmute your image or your microphone, people will both see and hear you, which is unlike a lot of our presentations. But we like the map lunches to have a more informal conversational tone, particularly during the Q&A. So we've been doing this series all year. We're going to have one more next month with Dr. Katie Parker, and we will pick them up again in the autumn. We will give everyone a sort of summer vacation from Monday Map Lunch. So today we are so pleased to welcome our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Schulten of the University of Denver, for a presentation entitled How Emma Willard Mapped Time, which is part of a forthcoming book on the pioneering 19th century educator, Emma Willard, which Susan will tell us a lot more about over the course of this afternoon's lunch hour. As a bit more of an intimate series, we're often featuring works in progress and discussions about process from artists and cartographers, map historians, geographers, curators, and anyone interested in geospatial issues writ large. Once Susan is done presenting, you will be more than welcome to drop questions into the chat. If you could just mute your mics for the duration of the presentation. You might also want to switch to speaker view on the top right-hand corner so you can have a wonderful view of Susan's slides and Susan herself. My colleague Louie Miller, who is our cartographic reference and teaching librarian here at the Map Library, is going to moderate the Q&A at the end with Susan. And so you might switch from presenter view or speaker view at the beginning into gallery view for the second part so we can have a really nice conversation between all of us. I would, given where we are sitting in Portland, just like to offer a land acknowledgement recognizing where we are in Machigan, the truest name in Maliseet poet Miku Paul's words of the now called city of Portland, Maine, where the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education sits on the campus of the University of Southern Maine. And we sit, as we're sort of ever reminded, actually, with all of the construction going on around us and changing seasons and climates, that we actually sit on land that was once water and once part of a water-based ecosystem, which for thousands of years before the French and English set foot on the neck, provided for the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland, the Wabanaki, and those who were here from the beginning in kinship with the land and with the water. And we acknowledge this truth, especially now here in 2022, as we acknowledge the contemporary presence and the sovereignty of the Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet peoples, the Wabanaki Confederacy. And as we acknowledge that sovereignty, we acknowledge the devastation of settler colonialism, past and present. And I think for everyone here today and wherever you are on the spectrum of your own work and identity around this, is you're welcome to join us in acknowledging that a land acknowledgement, even one delivered with great sincerity, is only a beginning to the collective work that we have. So thank you for that. I could spend the rest of the webinar introducing Susan, and delightedly so, which I would happily do, but I think I'll tell many friends in the room who know that Dr. Susan Schulten is professor of United States history at the University of Denver. She's the author of many books, among them the most recent, A History of America in 100 Maps, Mapping the Nation, History and Cartography in 19th Century America, and the Geographical Imagination in America, 1880 to 1950. And these are all published with the University of Chicago Press. And so in Susan's work, for me, as a fellow historian of the 19th century, I'm just struck by the brilliant and clever ways in which she brings into conversation primary sources and really brings us into process, brings us into the lives of people as they were living them, right? How they were using. I'm really attuned in your work, Susan, like you really bring to life how people were using maps, why people were making maps, like what role they were playing in the social and cultural fabric of the 19th century. I mean, I'm really excited in particular that getting to spend time on a book about Emma Willard, this incredible pioneering 19th century educator, that we will understand more about Willard and her time, but also the way in which she tries to map her place in time and historical time in general. And in so doing, really starts a movement of map education that we're only beginning to fully understand, certainly through a lot of your work. So welcome, my dear friend. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you all for being here. Special thanks to Libby and to Matthew Edney and Jessica Hovey and Louie Miller for I'm sorry, was I muted that whole time? I'll start over. How long have I been doing this? Thank you so much. I'm deeply indebted to Libby for this invitation, and to Libby and Jessica Hovey and Louie Miller and Matthew Edney for organizing this talk. You'll see as I speak that there's a pretty deep imprint that the Osher Map Library has had on my understanding of Emma Willard, and particularly the way in which Matthew Edney has helped me to understand the much larger picture of the history of map making, and how Libby Bischof has deeply attuned me to the meaning of visuals in the 19th century. So I'm going to turn it over to my screen. It's one of the silver linings of Zoom, is that for those of us who care deeply about visual culture, we can get as deep and close into it as we'd like. So I'm going to turn for most of the talk over to these slides because they're much more interesting than looking at me. So like many of you, and I see you on the call, I know that you share my deep interest and longstanding interest in Emma Willard. I've been thinking about Emma Willard for almost 20 years now, and only continue to be fascinated by the deeply human, that is also to say the talented as well as flawed parts of her, and the way that she brought, as Libby said, a new understanding of maps in American education across the 19th century. In 2020, I received a phone call from a colleague in San Francisco named RJ Andrews, who was thinking that as someone himself who was deeply interested in the history of information graphics, that there might be room for a series of books that went deeper into some of the path-breaking individuals. And so he invited me to contribute one of 3 of the first books in this series to Emma Willard. RJ shares my passion. We had met at the Stanford Library a few times, looking at Rumsey's extraordinary collection of Willard's work. And so since that period, at the end of 2020, I've been working on this. It was kind of a nice thing to do in pandemic because I had amassed so much work on Willard over the years and could continue to do so remotely. So I'm deeply grateful to RJ for giving me a kind of lifeline during the pandemic to keep going. And to find meaning when we were all so alienated from each other physically. Our work is nearly finished, and I'm pleased to show you a few images from that. I'll just show you right here the cover, and I'll talk a little bit more about the idea of the structure of the book. If you're interested, the book is now available for pre-order at a little bit of a discount, and you can go to visionarypress.com and learn more. Okay, but first to Emma Willard herself. What I want you to think about for the next hour is how Emma Willard was sort of deeply shaped by 2 themes. And the first is that everything that she creates, and almost everything she creates in the 19th century in her lifetime, was graphic in nature. Every bit of that was governed and grew out of her life experience as a student, as a female, as a mother, as a teacher, and perhaps most importantly, as a very, very ardent, even jingoistic American. The second thing I want you to pay attention to, and it'll be no surprise to those of you who work in the 19th century, is that this is a story about expansion on multiple levels. It's the story of expanding education, first as women came out of the home to be educated in schools. It's a story of profound expansion in terms of mobility and information. If you think about technologies such as the telegraph and the railroad, canals. It is also an era of tremendous territorial expansion, which had devastating consequences for the native peoples of North America, but which also enabled Americans to think of themselves as primarily a continental power. And of course, ultimately, it was that territorial expansion that brought the United States to the brink of its ruin in the American Civil War, the most devastating event of Emma Willard's lifetime, and one in which she was deeply, deeply engaged. So those themes, first of her life experience producing her graphic work, and secondly, the lifetime of living through and period of expansion as producing that graphic work, that I think can help us as we understand what she produced. And to do that, I want to go back and just quickly go through her early life. These images will not be surprising to any of you who work in the material culture of the Northeastern education, New England education of young women. These kinds of needlework samplers were essential as women were educated both in the home and then with Willard as the first generation of young girls to be educated outside of the home after American independence was achieved. There are lots of reasons for women moving outside of the home for education. Most importantly, the idea that as Republican mothers, they would need to have the education to shape their own children, primarily their sons. And Willard was part of that. Right at the turn of the 19th century, she began to move from being educated in the living room with her father primarily to the local schools in Berlin, Connecticut, where she quickly mastered the traditional curriculum that was offered to her. In about 1805 and 1806, she also spent just one term at a time over in Hartford at the two leading educational institutions for girls, Mrs. Royce and Patton schools. And the reason I offer that to you is that this was a formative experience for Willard. When she thought back about her early education, she was mostly, if I can be very candid, quite disappointed. She was disappointed at the rote nature of the school curriculum in her nearby school. And she was also disappointed in what was considered to be the finer arts of accomplishment that were offered to her in Hartford. She was extremely critical of needlework, and primarily because it was done for show as opposed to any practical end. And she said very colloquially, if you're going to teach women to sew, teach them to sew, to do something. Instead, what she saw at Mrs. Royce and Patton's school were materials such as this that were exquisitely done and now command extraordinary prices on the trade market, but which ultimately were about display as opposed to educating the individual. And I want you to remember that because what was her disappointment was also something that I think shaped her entire life, which was an early exposure to a deeply visual education. And we'll come back to that theme a few times. The other thing is an anecdote that I'd like to share with you. While she was at Mrs. Patton's school in 1805, she had a holiday that winter and went to visit a nearby relative in Hartford. And that relative had an extraordinary library, and she was in heaven for a few days. And during that time, she pulled down what was then the classic drawing manual, Lebrun's Characters of the Passions, Method of Drawing the Passions. This was originally a late 17th century style guide, if you will, to drawing that had been updated and reproduced across the 18th century. And her cousin had one oversized and very recently published. And she excitedly pulled it off the shelf. And as she recounted decades later, she tried to follow the steps for drawing the passions, the emotions. And she was quickly stymied, and she realized why. For all her education, her artistic education, as she put it, was quite superficial. And because she had never been exposed to geometry of all things, she realized she could not master these methods because she had no understanding of visual perspective. And that was a small anecdote, but I offer it to you because over and over she comes back to two things about that moment. One was what had been kept from her as a woman, the way in which her artistic education was superficial, was not deep enough, and did not involve math. And the second thing was how important visual perspective became to her as she began to think about pedagogy, first as a student and then as a student teacher. Indeed, she was taking classes in the earliest part of the 19th century at the same time as she was beginning to teach students of her own. And very quickly, because of her experience, she is offered multiple paths to preceptress, to being a master of her own local school. And the one she lands at that's the most important for us in 1807 is here at Middlebury. So she leaves home in the Connecticut River Valley and goes up to Middlebury, Vermont in about 1807. And at that time, Middlebury College had recently been founded. So this is a watercolor from the Sheldon Museum at just the time that she arrives. And it shows us the dominant feature of that town, which is Middlebury College, opened in 1800, and of course, opened only to young men. And she, in her early time at Middlebury, felt quite lonely. She was alone. She was separated from her deep connections to other women. Back in Hartford, she lost a good friend and was grieving as that in that time as well. And it was a lonely period for her. It became a little less lonely as her school began to show some success. And this initial school was the Middlebury Female Seminary. I'm going to throw a lot of school titles at you. Don't worry. I'll give you what you need to know to understand the point. And in that initial school that she inherits, it was modeled on Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy in Litchfield, Connecticut, with a fairly traditional female curriculum, but also a deeply visual female curriculum. And that goes well for her until she steps away after marrying John Willard. So Emma Hart becomes Emma Hart Willard. And she steps away not only because of marriage, but because she has her first and only child, John. And only within a few years, however, John Willard is struck by financial difficulties. And there's a kind of scandal in his position at the bank that he works at in Middlebury. What's fascinating to me is that Emma Willard could have gone back to teaching in the home or working at the Middlebury Female Seminary, but instead she opens a much more ambitious school on her own. In other words, she always recounted that this was a product of necessity, that she wasn't, if you will, someone who was destined to work outside the home, as was not so common in 1810, but she did so to help her family. And yet I think she makes a very intentional choice when creating a school of her own. And that school is run in the home of John and Emma Hart. And this is the earliest advertisement we have from the Plattsburgh Republican in New York. So she's already advertising in the wider area, not just in Vermont locally, not just in Middlebury, but also in Eastern New York. And you can see here that she's offering what was a very traditional curriculum at first when she opens her doors in 1814. And she does that very shrewdly. She knows that Middlebury is not exactly what you would call an experimental community. In fact, she found it quite hidebound and traditional. And so she needed to secure a kind of continuous base of enrollments. And so initially her curriculum is very traditional and models itself on the existing schools in New England. But soon after that, she begins to branch out and offer things that no other teacher was offering. And the reason we know this is thanks to Jim Arsenault, who I know is on the call. Several years ago, Jim Arsenault offered this item at auction, which ended up in the Dobkin Family Connection of Feminism, which is curated in New York by the wonderful Sarah Funke Butler. And I encourage you to take a look at what they have to offer. It's really an extraordinary collection. And if you look very, very closely, you can see the name Eliza H. Henshaw at Miss Willard's School, 1816. And this is an important breakthrough for me. And I'm really grateful to Jim and to Sarah for making this item available to me. Because what it shows us is how Emma Willard was operating in the classroom in one of the first advanced students that she had the opportunity to teach. because in 1816, she moves beyond that traditional curriculum and starts to offer education for girls who otherwise should have been going to someplace like Middlebury College, but because of the deeply segregated nature of education at the time, didn't have that opportunity. She was embittered by that. Those are her phrases, right? She cannot believe every morning when she wakes up, she walks outside her front door and she sees the incredible opportunities that are available to young men at Middlebury College, while her students have to be educated in the cramped quarters of the Willard family home. And this anger and disappointment becomes a fuel for a new prong of her reformist efforts that we'll come back to in a minute. But to linger on Eliza Henshaw for just a second, this is one of the many student works that we feature in the book that's coming out, because we want to show what Emma Willard was exposed to as a student, but also what her students were producing. And I find it fascinating that in some ways, the education that she's offering is traditional. In other words, this is a page from Eliza Henshaw's journal that copies astronomical information from Jedediah Morse's popular textbook at the time. And yet she's also helping at the earliest stages of her career as a teacher, visual and graphic approaches to help her students see what they're learning about. There's no contemporary textbook that offers this level of visualization in astronomy. In fact, it's almost all narrative. And yet, even in the earliest periods of her teaching career, she's translating those ideas, that narrative, into graphic form. The bulk of the atlas is a series of maps. And you wouldn't know it just to look at this in a vacuum, but actually what she's doing here with Eliza is quite a departure. And I'll show you that in just a second. The narrative at right, again, is taken from various textbooks at the time, chiefly from Jedediah Morse's, but also others that were available to her. But at left, what I'd like you to notice is that Emma Willard is having her students draw, to the extent that they can, freehand and often from memory, because the prevailing style of map drawing, which was so popular at the time, and I know many of you work on children's maps who are on this call, was something that she found absolutely deadening and really useless, in the same way that she found the needle arts somewhat useless, trivial, and really not advancing any practical or deeper education. If a student was going to show any proficiency in geography, she said, they would be able to draw the map from memory. And so most of Eliza Henshaw's maps are in this style, which are not traced, if you can see the paper. They are actually drawn either by seeing something on the wall or also from memory. To really highlight what a departure this was, I want to draw your attention to Eliza's little sister. So very quickly after Eliza Henshaw finished, and I'll come back to this in a second, Emma Willard left Middlebury, and not on good terms. She was frustrated by the limitations that the town put on her ambitions. And once she left, there was only one school available, and that was the Middlebury Female Academy, a more traditional school that she had run when she had first arrived. So again, there's only one school in town. It's a fairly traditional school, and Eliza's younger sister, Frances Henshaw, is educated at the Middlebury Female Academy. And this is the journal of geography that she produces. It's much different than Eliza's. You can see the exacting nature of the maps. You can see the emphasis on execution, on style and color. And this is much more typical, as Libby can tell you, of the maps that are made by school children in the earliest decades of the 19th century, of which Osher has a substantial collection. Here's some others I've drawn from the Clements Library, where Mary Pedley is so wonderful at helping people make sense of these, from the Rumsey collection, from the Boston Public Library, and in the lower left, Catherine Cook, that's another one from the Osher Map Library. You can see that Frances and her colleagues here are all really emphasizing geography as a kind of artistic performance, if you will. And this is something that Emma Willard really soundly and thoroughly rejected as soon as she had the freedom to start her own school. All of this frustration, disappointment comes to a head in the late 18 teens. And I pause here to move away from maps just for a moment so you can realize that Emma Willard is critiquing and frustrated with education that's offered to women generally, not just in the realm of geography. And so decades later, she's reflecting on her experience at this time when she was at Middlebury. And she says, my boarding school was opposite the college in Middlebury, and numbers of my pupils had brothers there. With their learned president and professions, I was well acquainted and knew all of their superior advantages of separate rooms for study and recitation of books. I bitterly felt the disparity between the facilities of the two sexes. I would not believe that men willingly and with reflection did us this injustice. I hoped that if the matter was once fairly set before them as legislators, that they would be ready to correct their error. Translated, she says, it was unfair, and I'm sure that the men in the state legislature in Vermont would change this if they knew that it was unfair. And to that end, with her husband's full endorsement and help, she writes a proposal for how to reform female education. She realizes that it doesn't matter if her Middlebury Female Seminary offers students advanced education in natural philosophy or rhetoric or geometry. If there's not reform on a larger scale, it's not going to change the situation. The response is just what we would call crickets. There's no support from the president of Middlebury College. In fact, he won't even let her on campus to sit in on a college course and learn from what the boys are learning. There's no support from the state legislature. There's not even the willingness in the state capital of Vermont to let Emma Willard use a few vacant buildings to launch a new school. This was a pretty dramatic awakening for her and a deeply humbling and insulting experience. And so she packs her bags and moves west and moves over to what she thinks will be a more receptive audience in New York. First, she finds home in a town where many of her students had come from. And then she ultimately lands, more importantly for our purposes, in Troy. And in Troy, near Albany, this gives you a sense of the bustling growth that was happening right as she arrives in 1821. Remember that it's 1825 when the Erie Canal opens. And I cannot emphasize enough that technological advancement, what that did to open her eyes to the extraordinary growth in transportation that would mean for that region. It would mean for the hinterland west, and it would mean for bringing that western reach into the orbit of New York. In other words, this technological and transportation advancement really changed her orientation. And actually, for being rejected in Vermont, she's really quite fortunate to be pushed westward to Troy, which is very near all this activity. In contrast, Vermont in some ways had seen its most robust growth already and would struggle across the 19th century to maintain population. So that move in time and space really matters for how she begins to think. And this moment is also important for two reasons. 1821 is a seminal moment for her professionally. It's when she opens her first and most ambitious school with large-scale support from the community around her, the Troy Female Seminary. But what I'd like to focus on here for the next few minutes is what it means for her in terms of her publication reach. In other words, at the same moment that she opens the Troy Female Seminary, she also launches an extended career as a textbook and graphic author. And every publication that she issues from 1821 until her death leans into graphics because it reflects her own experience in the classroom, her lifelong conviction that people learn through visuals, not through narrative alone. The first publication that she offers in 1821, which comes out in 1822, leans into that graphic way of thinking. It's a collaboration with her co-author, William Woodbridge, himself someone who had taught and worked at Gallaudet, the Institute for the Deaf, which forced him too to think about alternative ways of teaching to a deaf population. And so in their first collaboration, which is an ancient and modern geography together in one volume, the first thing that Emma Willard wants her students to see is not text, but image. So William Woodbridge assigns her the first part of the text, the ancient volume. And what she does, and I'll show you the image at left, both in full and in zoom. She wants her students to see ancient history visually. And so what she offers is a picture of Roman history in the form of the Amazon River. And I know it strikes us as odd. What could one have to do with the other? But what she's reaching for here is a visual metaphor that will stick in the student's mind, that will help the student remember, if you will, because the gold standard of education in the 19th century is memory, what Emma Willard calls artificial memory. In other words, memory that's generated as opposed to natural. And so what she's got for you here is an image that's going to show you from the earliest moment of recorded Roman history at the top down to the bottom, how Roman history can be understood as a civilization, much like the Amazon River absorbs tributaries, absorbs more minor civilizations. In other words, it's a graphic that does work on multiple levels. And for her, that would stick in the student's mind on multiple levels. And after having this image in their head, the students could move forward through the text and think about where the narrative fit in the visual that they had already generated. So even from the get-go, I find it fascinating that the first time she experiments with publishing, she wants to do so graphically as well as narratively. All through the 1820s, she publishes a series of textbooks of ancient geography, of geography for the young, and American history that are paired with atlases. And I'll show you just a few of these images to give you a sense of her visual experimentation. This is the last image from her ancient atlas, which took a few years because of publishing delays. It doesn't come out until 1827. It's quite rare. But what she's done here is to take an image that is not original to her. This was a common image from the most popular historical atlas of the time, known as the Lesage Atlas. One of those images tried to help people think about the barbarian invasions through graphics as well as narrative. And so Emma Willard streamlines that for her students and offers this as the last image of her ancient atlas after a series of maps, which we recreate in the book in full. I'll zoom in for you. She's trying to show the migration of these barbarous, if you will, tribes across a few centuries. What I want to leave you with here is that what really strikes Willard about this image and the reason she wants to use it to teach students is that it is an attempt to show history through graphics. It is an attempt to have a map tell time and to collapse long-standing changes onto a single image. And so the last image that she leaves students with in her ancient atlas is adapted as the first image of her subsequent atlas published the next year, her American Historical Atlas. And she uses this for multiple purposes. I know Libby shares my fascination with this image, and she and I have talked at length about it. The series of maps that Emma Willard publishes in 1828 grows directly out of her classroom experience at Troy. She says, on any given day, my female students can draw American history on a map. And what she means is that she taught them to draw eras and to draw the most important events and migrations of any given moment in American history. Of course, it's critical here that when she talks about American history, she's incorporating all of the colonial period as the prehistory or the prelude, if you will, to the independence of the United States. And the opening map of that series that she publishes in 1828 is exactly modeled on that barbarous invasion map. In other words, I'll zoom in for you here. Using color, using arrows, using lines to show migration across time. So the pedagogy of the map is crucial. She wants maps to work, to really help us see things in flux. The other crucial thing that tells you so much about Willard's sensibility here is that she considers this not the first map of American history, but the introductory. And that's a very, very deliberate use of language because she considers Native Americans prehistory, not human history. And in fact, they were destined in her minds in very graphic and very punitive ways to disappear. We talk a lot about this in the book and as a way to try to understand Emma Willard as deeply, deeply a product of the 19th century and the assumptions that Native peoples were not part of US history and were not really sovereign owners of the land. And we try to do justice to that. First, to be honest about Willard's background and her arguments, but also to show that these were deeply assumed understandings of the time. We reproduce every map in this Atlas of American History for a few reasons. First, Emma Willard is a pioneer here. She is the first American to draw a historical atlas of the United States. And in that sense alone, she is pathbreaking. But we also do so because we want to show just how deeply these images grow out of her experience as a teacher. Every graphic that she publishes is a product of her experience at Middlebury and more consequentially at Troy, and then in the public schools, which we'll talk about in just a second. All of these maps in the series of maps show her attention to detail. They show her trying to convey to students through color, through iconography, and through anecdotes, through illustrations, what she considers to be the most seminal moments. And of course, she is a very, very ardent patriot. And so what you'll see in this series of maps is that what Emma Willard privileges is not contingency, but in other words, the events that ultimately anticipate the Anglo-American settlement and conquest of the continent. Here's just a couple more to give you a sense. Each one of these signaling what she calls an era of American history. I go back just to a second to the classroom at Troy. We found this thanks to the archivist at the Emma Willard School about a year ago, and it shows you, it's undated, but we believe it to be about the 1830s, that when the school is at the height of its early influence and beginning to draw students from all over the country, especially daughters of landed gentry in the southern slaveholding states, how deeply visual her education is intended to be. This is the recitation room at the Troy Female Seminary. And I offer you at right another observation that she makes about graphic learning. Mere straight lines not wrought into a picture and presenting no form or comeliness to the eye are unattractive. The young do not feel any wish to look at them, and they carry away no distinct impression. They are like a succession of monotonous sounds, which no one remembers, while the arrangement of sounds in tunes or in lines of pictures are attended to with pleasure, easily remembered. So again, the visual education that she herself had, however inadequate in her own mind, was something she brought throughout her life when she tried to understand how students would actually learn. This is also a seminal moment for her in about 1831, 1832, because after publishing a series of atlases, whoops, there we go, Emma Willard begins to see the limits of geographical maps. And she reflects in the early 1830s that there are ways in which timelines as well as maps can't really do justice to history. In other words, timelines are limited in the way that they represent time in increments, and maps are limited in the way they can tell you anything about place. And so she tries to combine the two in the 1830s and 40s by leaning into graphic timelines. Here's one that she publishes in 1835, which I know is familiar to many of you. Her perspective sketch, she also calls it her stream of time. And what I'd like you to recall is that here going forward, every graphic has a kind of pictorial quality. Like I said, a mere timeline is not enough. And so she leans into a few things here with her perspective sketch of the history of civilization. I'll zoom in for you in just a minute. First, I'd like you to notice that however subtly the graphic moves in time toward the viewer, she realizes that it's too subtle and she makes it more pronounced in later iterations. But from the creation forward, she wants you to feel as though time is not just widening because there's more happening, but it's also moving toward you because recent history, in her language, is more relevant to the student. The second thing you can notice is that she uses light and shade. And I'll zoom in for just a second, but you can look at the Dark Ages, if you will, at left, which she uses shade to de-emphasize, while other areas such as the Roman Empire are enlightened and highlighted to draw attention to their importance. To zoom in here, you can get a closer sense where at left and right, time moves in fairly, but not completely fixed increments. In other words, she will draw attention to periods that are more and less important chronologically. And then also spatially, what she's trying to show you is that areas and civilizations that intermingled are brought together. In other words, they are streams, whereas civilizations that have no contact with one another are demarcated. They do not flow into one another. Again, I draw your attention back to that early experience she had with visual perspective and geometry. An attempt here is made to exhibit history in its proper relative proportions. The painter allows to objects in space less and less room upon his canvas as those objects recede into the distance. Such is equally the order of nature in regard to objects as they exist in time. Yet the distant mountain must have more room in the picture than the dark valley that lies near. Thus tower Greece and Rome amid the dimness of antiquity, and thus sink the Dark Ages, though nearer to the foreground. So she's drawing again on that hard-won mastery of geometry that she did on her own in order to show and to flex her muscle as an artist, as well as a geographer and a historian. One more as she draws attention to what her are the seminal moments in world history. Of course, the birth of Christ, the arrival of Columbus in the New World, the Reformation, and then at center in American independence. So this kind of creativity and experimentation really dominates her thinking in the 1830s. And then in the late 1830s, she is again struck with a very challenging personal situation. After the death of her first husband, she remarries in what is a marriage that ends in disaster. She takes great pains, even moving to Connecticut, where she has personal connections in order to secure a divorce. And while she is in Connecticut, she leaves the governance of her school in New York to her son and his wife, while she tries to find something to do back home near Hartford. And she is incredibly honored when the public school system in Berlin, Connecticut, her hometown, asks her to be the superintendent. And I want to stress this because back to our theme of expansion, Emma Willard goes from heading a private school for girls only in a fairly elite situation to being in charge of a public school system at a time when common schools, public schools, were exploding in the 1840s. And her short period in 1841 and 1842 in charge of these schools really teaches her how much The school population is diversifying in terms of ethnicity and in terms of class, not to mention co-education. And so what we see in the publications of the 1840s and 50s is her really doubling down on graphics as a way to reach the widest possible audience. It's in the 1840s that she contracts with a publisher to offer a much abridged and highly illustrated edition of her American history textbook. And what I'd like to show you here is the way in which she pairs that, not just with illustrations throughout of important moments in American history, but at left here, again, the first thing she would like students to see and to grapple with is a picture of what follows. And so just as the stream of time was for her the thing she wanted students to think about before they read her universal or world history, the tree of time is what she'd like students in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s to think about before they read her textbook of American history. This is a simplified, a streamlined version of the graphic, and I'll show you just a few things. First, the narrative at bottom is meant to be self-explanatory. At left, we have a peaceful arrival of settlers to North America, welcomed by natives, who will then disappear at right as Emma Willard fully embraces the narratives of expansion, of technological advancement and American movement into the West. She's working, of course, at the height of the market revolution, the commercial expansion, and continental expansion that we'll talk about in just a minute. So that's the narrative at bottom, intended to reach an audience of students at varied levels of literacy. And then the graphic itself. I admit that the graphic is difficult. Many of Emma Willard's graphics were not copied. They did not work. But what she wants people to think about here is history as a clock and a tree. And of course, those metaphors don't fully work. But she's trying to help people divide and organize the past into periods. So the outermost is the centuries. And then within that, she has divisions of parts, which are her understandings of how American history is bookended. And then within that, you see the branches that use their extension to mark important events, moments of consolidation, conflicts, etc. This is one published in 1844, so right on the eve of American expansion, which will, of course, change and challenge the tree. Emma Willard is so convinced of the power of this graphic, especially for the public schools that are growing, that she doubles down and creates one for the classroom. Just to pause here, it was really an education for me as someone who never thought much about history to realize that the common school, the public school education that I inherited in the late 20th century was, of course, a product of history. And as much as we like to think that maps and other graphics that are hanging on school walls have always been there, it's people like Martin Bruckner who have taught me that it's really the common school revolution that makes larger classrooms common and typical. And those larger classrooms create a demand for graphics. And so you see a proliferation of school maps in the 1830s, 40s, 50s as common schools themselves grow. And so what we'd like to do in the book is to do justice to the way that many of the graphics she created were intended to be seen in front of a classroom. And she has a very explicit guide for a teacher to walk through a graphic like this for her students. So again, she's thinking very, very consciously about who's in those classrooms and how they might be educated differently than in the small schoolrooms that she was privy to in her own education and in the girls' schools that she headed in New England. She reckons with the limits of her graphics quite often. And so what you see across her career is her tweaking, updating, streamlining. And I've tried to do justice to that by paying attention to the correspondence that she's had with her publisher as he encourages her to think differently, think in certain ways about how to communicate her graphics to a much wider audience. And so in the mid-1840s, just after she's created the tree of time, she realizes that her stream of time that I'm showing you here has limited reach, that teachers are having a hard time understanding it. And so what she does is to create a new graphic language. And this one I know is quite familiar to many of you, her entire series of temples of time that she begins to publish in the 1840s. This one is her trying to draw again on an existing image, a classical structure, to help students organize the total unfolding of human history. And so here she's put the stream of time as the floor work, if that's not obvious to you. She's simplified it vastly, but you can still see the stream flowing toward you. And then she's added what ultimately become an interactive device. The columns are centuries with leaders, and the ceiling is populated by different important peoples. And so here is her original temple of time. And here is how she updates it and colors it for a different issue late in the 1840s. We've shown various iterations of this in the book and given lots of details to try to break it down and show you how it operates. The one thing I'd like to leave you with here is her emphasis that the student will draw the temple on her own and then fill in the squares, the columns on their own time as they read the text. So however complicated or unwieldy this may seem to us, it's quite interesting to me that she intends it as an interactive device in order to reinforce memory. Here's just a couple details where she uses color to try to signal time. And in a later edition, she will also make room in the ceiling for what she calls eminent women, which I think is interesting. In other words, she's evolving alongside her materials. I leave you with just one quote that she sends to her closest friend when she confidently says, after creating the temples of time, "In history, I have invented the map," which reminds us that Emma Willard is not modest. This is a woman with extraordinary confidence. And that confidence, I think, is part of what helps us to explain why she was willing and able to go toe-to-toe with some of the heaviest hitters in the 19th century, such as Peter Parley and other textbook authors who dominated the market. She frequently engaged in conflicts and rivalries with those who she thought were stealing some of her ideas. And that is one of the through lines of this book, is that this is a woman who is engaging in a deeply competitive market and has to bring all kinds of resources to that, along with her publisher, in order to defend and expand her place in that market. One of the most important graphics, and I think one of her greatest legacies, is also one of the most modest. And I don't think she could have understood what a legacy this would have. But I'll leave you with the moment in which she is perhaps most ardently patriotic, even jingoistic, and that is at the outbreak of the US-Mexico War, a very brief conflict which she believed was an extraordinarily exciting event. Exciting not just because of the military conquest, but because it would bring in an enormous tract of land to complete America's continental manifestation. Emma Willard was not shy about this. She was an ardent exponent of manifest destiny. And in real time, she is chronicling this in her additions to her textbook and at her publisher's encouragement, a book published in 1853, Last Leaves of American History, which excitedly chronicles the drama between American and Mexican troops. I leave you with that because this is the opening graphic, which she first publishes in Spanish to help welcome, if you will, the newest American citizens in the American Southwest. I emphasize this because it is Emma Willard who first draws a graphic that chronicles American history as a series of peaceful geographic accessions. what she's showing us here is so normalized for us and so much a part of how we think about American history that many of us don't think twice about it. If you open up any American history textbook of the 20th century, it will have a version of this graphic in it. And it is Emma Willard who first offers that in Spanish and then immediately translated into English. It is important because it is the one of her graphics that is most widely copied and assimilated into the American assumption that expansion is indeed a peaceful process and is, if anything, inevitable. To close, I'd like to just give you a sense, we can come back to this, I don't really have time at the moment, but I'll just give you a sense of her enormous reach by showing you an unexpected little addition and gift I got from the American Antiquarian Society, and that is her publisher's trade list. These trade lists are very, very hard to find, but here's one from 1857 at the height of Emma Willard's reach and power, which is of course also the height of the sectional crisis that will lead to the American Civil War, a disastrous event that completely confounded Emma Willard and challenged every inevitability that she had assumed to be the engine of American history. And if we zoom in, we can see that right front and center, what Alfred Barnes, her publisher, offers is a catalog of American history through Emma Willard. At center there, his history list is dominated by Willard's graphics, by what she can do to help American students understand their geographical past. All of this is showcased in our book, and I'll just show you a couple pages that RJ sent to me this morning to share and to give you a sense of where we're headed. Like I said, it's one of 3 books, all of which are devoted to uncovering the yet to be fully acknowledged contributions of 19th century Europeans and Americans in organizing information into graphic form. In other words, what we're trying to do here is to highlight the way in which the 19th century brought a revolution in graphic visual culture. RJ, who's a master of design, has partnered with folks who understand how to best showcase these materials. And so I'll show you just a few pages. What we've done at first is to give an extended essay to explore Emma Willard primarily through her graphics, but showing the things I showed and highlighted to you today, how her education, how her experience, how her reckoning with expansion, with slavery, with the market, all shaped her understanding of education and graphics. And then we turn over to the graphics themselves and do justice to each of her products, whether it's her atlases, where we can unfold these in large format, her charts, which we can show you in large format, and also the folks who have influenced her, such as her collaborator, William Woodbridge, and other graphic artists. We also offer RJ's tremendous work in cataloging all of her graphic work to give you a sense of her full career. And at left, what he's done is to showcase the way in which these can be seen in their real space. In other words, to give you a sense of size and materiality. Finally, we had some fun by showing some of the people who used Emma Willard's graphics, such as this recent addition to the Rumsey collection, which is a young female student who was obviously copying the stream of time and showing the reach of Emma Willard's work across the country. With that, I'll stop. I know I've gone over a little bit in terms of time, but I wanted to give you a sense of how the hard work that we've done in the course of the pandemic is hopefully going to see light soon. I see my colleague RJ is on the line, so I'd like to acknowledge his tremendous creativity and patience and the degree to which I've learned from him, as well as Matthew Edney and Libby Bischof. So I thank you and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, for such a fascinating presentation. I can't wait to read the book when it comes out. I just want to remind people that you can put your questions in the chat box. You can also use on the bottom of your screen, you can click on reactions and click raise hand if you'd like to speak your question instead. So we'll give folks a couple minutes to submit those questions as they come in. Also a reminder that this is being recorded, so you're always welcome to come back and have a chance to rewatch this.
Louie, can I add something that I forgot?
Yeah, sure, Susan, go
I'm
ahead.
so sorry. I actually can't remember if I said this, but thanks to RJ's very persuasive invitation, Matthew Edney has written a tremendous foreword for the book. And I want to acknowledge the incredible work he did to put Emma Willard, not just in a national, but into an international context. So you will have Matthew's incredible essay as well, which I really appreciate.
Karen, if you would like to unmute and ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm Karen Lewis. I've been a fan of your work, Susan, for quite some time. I'm coming from Columbus, Ohio, where I'm an associate professor of architecture, and also a colleague of mine on this call, Francesca Torello. She and I met when we were taking a seminar at the Newberry Library together. And I know Jim Ackerman is a colleague and friend of yours. So it's just great to be amongst all these friends. My question is, I couldn't help but light up when I heard you talk about Emma Willard's exposure to the Erie Canal. And the minute you said the Erie Canal, of course, in my mind, visually, I leapt to that very famous drawing of hers of the sort of time buffeted by what I was assuming are these kind of concrete walls. There's such a strong relationship to the architecture of infrastructure, not just architecture in terms of a pantheon, but the physicality of infrastructure, be it even with some of the maps that you were showing of these regions. I couldn't help but think of the telegraph wires, or this kind of almost like affect of communication becoming a territory. And I just wanted to kind of enthusiastically prompt that maybe comment more so than a question about not just forms of buildings, but forms of infrastructures being significant to the graphic visualization of her work. And if that's something that has kind of come up, and I so excitedly look forward to reading the book. I'm going to pre-order it right after this call.
I did give a hard sell, didn't I? Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate that, because RJ and I spent a lot of time talking about what the telegraph in particular and the canal might have meant to her, because she comments on it frequently in the 1830s and 40s. And there's a moment in a little bit later than that when she's writing an extended letter to a colleague where it's hard to put into words, and I'm not going to do her justice, but Karen, what she's trying to say is the telegraph is going to transform not just mobility, but information. People are going to be inundated with information. They wake up and the news is like an avalanche. And I just thought, God, how we can relate in the same way. But she was going through something quite similar. And what it did, Karen, is to make her realize that's why graphics are even more important, because what graphics can do is collapse data. And so she thought to herself, you know what, people have less time than ever to luxuriate in history. She was sort of anticipating the crisis of the humanities, right? Like, who's going to want to read history when things are happening in real time and we're learning about all these conflicts worldwide? And so she said, this is even more a reason for us to lean into visual learning, not just for students, but for lay people. And so she really did foresee a future that would be saturated with visual information. What I hadn't thought, and what you just drew my attention to, was the way you said infrastructure itself has a visual quality that might have been influencing her own graphics. And I'd like to sit with that, because that's something I hadn't actually considered.
I would be honored to sit with you. Because it struck me just so immediately. I'm like, oh, that's the canal. That's just, it's totally the design of the canal. So
thank you.
Yeah,
I
sure.
took some notes.
I like that. Yeah, great.
And
Thank
if anyone
you.
else wants to pipe in, I think that's the whole point of an informal exchange like this.
Well, I'm going to selfishly, if no one else is going to raise their hand, I have a definite question for Susan. you know, you're so heavily invested in this project and with Willard as a person. How do you as a historian sort of reconcile your sort of analytical and, you know, more objective looking at her with sort of, you know, we're people, we get attached to the people that we research and get to know. Can you speak a little about maybe that tension or lack thereof, or just interested to hear about your personal opinions about Willard?
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's something that RJ and I worked on together and tussled with a bit, because RJ comes at this with a profound appreciation, even more than I did, of design, and really helped me understand how much work she was doing mentally and intellectually that I had a little bit overseen, perhaps because of the familiarity I had with Willard for so many years. But through long Zoom calls, RJ drew me, just in the way Karen just did, to aspects that I didn't fully appreciate, graphics as well as maps. I think, Louie, for me, when you get really close to a subject, you also, well, Willard was very explicit. She was explicit about her racial views, quite honest about her ego, and simultaneously believing that women had been shortchanged, but also an ardent critic of women's rights, not property rights. She learned firsthand what happens when a man is marrying you for your money, but she was deeply opposed to voting rights, for instance. She had very harsh things to say about Seneca Falls, even though her most famous student was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so I love that you asked that, because I have really struggled with that. And a couple of times RJ said, you're being kind of hard on her, don't you think? And that partly comes also from, you know, really reckoning with her racial views, which are, that's a tough one, right? And she's pretty explicit in the textbooks about that, and also in her letters. And in the Reconstruction period, she kind of put it all out there. Even as she was willing to acknowledge by the end of the Civil War that fault and responsibility squarely lay with Southern slaveholders. She also thought that the most important thing was compromise, and she was willing to compromise on a lot of things. So that is a tension, and I have struggled to hit the right note, if you will, to acknowledge what an extraordinary visionary she was in terms of women's education, graphic learning, her assertiveness, and also be honest about who she was.
Thank you so much. And I want to just do it in order of the questions. We have about 5 minutes, so apologies if we can't get to everything. But Stacy DeFazio mentioned, did Emma Willard mentor other girls and young women to encourage them in this sort of graphic work?
Indeed. And one of the wonderful discoveries I made before this book was that the series of maps, her first historical atlas, as well as the ancient atlas, were collaborations with former female students at Troy. And in fact, the series of maps of American history was meant to stand on its own. In other words, she thought that maps could substitute for text. The textbook that becomes her most important legacy, her greatest seller, was in fact written by her students. And so she is happy to draw on student talent. And there are many famous women who get their start at Troy, many of them after she's retired, right? But absolutely, she is willing to collaborate with them and to promote their talents in her own publications. And she's honest about that. She doesn't hide that. That's in the book Acknowledgement itself.
Wonderful. I think Phil, you had your hand up, so if you want to go ahead, and I think this will just be probably the last question of this event.
Thank you. So I'll try to keep this very terse and short. So I know you talked about it a little bit in response to, you know, the challenges you're having with reconciling some of her views vis-a-vis some of the contemporary issues of the time. But what struck me as really interesting in the beginning of your presentation is, was there any, you know, direct evidence as to why she sort of artificially divided Native peoples into prehistory versus American history?
Yes, and that was quite common, Phil, at the time. The belief that Native Americans were the domain of anthropology, or ethnology, as it was then called. In other words, they didn't have a written, recorded history, and therefore did not sort of, I hate to put it this way, didn't qualify as part of human history. I mean, also, it's her racial views. I mean, it's really quite hard to read some of the passages in the textbook where she sees disease as divinely ordained. And that she really did believe that some of these diseases were God's way of clearing the land, if you will, for the destiny of white settlers. So that was very typical of the time. She's not out on a limb there, and she is inheriting those views. Louie, if it's okay, I know RJ's on the call. RJ, do you want to, he's been such a wonderful collaborator. Do you want to say anything? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do want to recognize your work.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is a great kind of like discussion on how do you acknowledge, kind of all the bad taste with all, and while celebrating all the good stuff. And one of the privileges of the series is that it's very specific, and that we are looking at the information graphics and some of the creative contributions. And that's not to say that we don't acknowledge some of this other stuff in the works, but the focus is on their positive contributions to this tradition. And more than that is, I'm not a professional historian, but I am a professional creative. And as a creative, what I really understand is something that all of these historic creatives had to do, which is the enormous amount of effort it takes to do anything new and to create anything original. And so the series really seeks to acknowledge that. And also, as authors ourselves, as editors of these books, we sort of have to become champions for these people, even though they're flawed. We have to become champions, because if we don't become champions, then all the lessons that they have bestowed upon us, might become lost. Like they really deserve some champions. And so that's at least how I see my own role as a creator, is that there's some really great stuff here. And isn't it remarkable that they were able to accomplish what they accomplished? And that's what we're trying to spotlight.
Yeah, and thanks to folks like Jim Arsenault who have found some of this stuff at auction, but also I'll add that we have uncovered, and I'm really grateful to archivists at Princeton and some map collectors as well, and dealers. We've uncovered some of her work that's never been seen, and the Library of Congress had assumed was lost. So some temples of time that were thought to be unknown. The Louie Miller on the call was one of the first people to help me locate one of her geography for beginner textbooks. And the accompanying atlas at Stanford was discovered when some of these things have been lost, or thought lost. And so that's been one of the joys, is RJ's sort of arduous efforts and patience to get some of this stuff out of lost archives and back into print. Thank you, Louie.
Yeah, and that goes across all the books. In particular, the Florence Nightingale volume has a dozen hand-drawn draft diagrams that the public's never seen before, which is just spectacular. If you're familiar at all with the Nightingale story and her date of his work, the fact that we have her hand-drawn edits on hand-drawn data visualization is just incredible.
Thank you so much, RJ, for that, and thank you again, Susan. I think we can all sort of virtually give Dr. Susan Schulten a hand for this fantastic presentation. Like I said, it will be recorded, and stay tuned for the next edition of Monday Math Lunch. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
And Louie, I'm happy to respond to people's questions in the text, and I'll reach out.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Susan. Thanks, everyone.